Did you know that 92% of people believe that they handle criticism well, but only 36% of their peers agree? This highlights a significant gap between self-perception and how other people believe that we handle criticism, suggesting that many people might be more sensitive to criticism than they realize. This discrepancy often stems from cognitive biases, like the better than average effect, where people tend to overestimate their abilities in certain areas, including emotional resilience. I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about how to handle criticism like a pro. In this case, it's better to be one of the 36% than one of the 92, and I'm going to teach you how. First, let's talk about common reactions to receiving criticism. It can be very normal when receiving criticism to have an emotional reaction. This often steers from a fear of rejection or a fear that we may not be as good at something as we think we are. A lot of self-proclaimed perfectionists often struggle the most with criticism because they believe that this criticism could be evidence that they're not as perfect as they'd like to be, and instead of embracing that with a growth mindset, they resist that in an effort to preserve their own self-perception of perfection. But as we all know, perfection is an illusion. All we can strive for is to be the best person that we can be, and that requires having a growth mindset. Having a growth mindset means you do need to be open to criticism, whether it's meant constructively or even if it's not. You still need to take it for what it's worth. First, let's discuss a few techniques for overcoming internal cognitive biases. One of my favorite techniques is reminding myself that part of having a growth mindset is challenging myself to constantly be growing. What I prefer to do, instead of seeking evidence that I'm perfect at something, is seeking evidence that I'm not, so that then I can tackle what that gap is and then validate my own internal belief that I am a learner by demonstrating that I've learned and grown from feedback. This can involve setting a different target for yourself. Instead of your target being perfection or the illusion of perfection, your target instead is constantly demonstrating growth. When you wish to demonstrate growth, what that does is it gives you the opportunity and it opens the door for you to be constantly requesting feedback and looking for ways that you can improve and grow. In this way, you can actually control a lot of the criticism that comes your way and welcome it, because it gives you an opportunity to turn something around or improve a skill where you may be lacking in that skill. The next technique is using a phrase called "I'm open to the possibility." So if you're the kind of person where you get really turned off by toxic positivity, in this case, toxic positivity would look like saying, "I love feedback, this is amazing," when that's not how you feel, because then you're just trying to gaslight yourself. Instead, what you do is you tell yourself, "I'm open to the possibility that I can learn from this. I'm open to the possibility that I might have room for growth." That gives you a more positive outlook without leaning into toxic positivity. There's another mindset shift I also like to use in order to welcome constructive criticism or feedback, and that is to look at your work as a craft. So when you look at your work as a craft, what that does is it changes how you think about your work. So instead of seeing your work as an extension of yourself, when you say, "This is my craft," you create some separation from your identity. The work you're doing is something that you're doing. It is separate from who you actually are fundamentally as a person. When you see it as a craft, you're open to the idea of honing that craft and realizing that that craft requires skills. Everybody lands differently with different skills, and all skills can be practiced and grown. So you see those skills not as an innate part of you, but as something that you can learn and grow and improve on in order to then hone your craft. This has been an incredible change for me in my career personally when I started thinking about the work I was doing as a craft that other people practice, a craft that other people know things about. That made me much more receptive to hearing things about that craft from people who maybe knew more about certain areas of it or had more experience in it or saw something in me that they wanted to share with me. So thinking about the work you do as a craft that you can learn and improve on and that requires skills that you can hone and grow is incredibly helpful. And it's not even a mind trick. Like, you think of it as a mind trick, but it's not. It's really just a shift in how you think about what you're doing versus who you are, which we'll touch on a little bit later when we talk about specific techniques for handling criticism in the moment. So again, 3 of the biggest techniques that you can use are to shift into a growth and learner mindset and set that as your target. I have a growth mindset. I am a constant learner. I want to constantly be learning and growing. The second thing you can do is look at things more positively, but not with toxic positivity, but by saying, I'm open to the possibility. And the third technique is to look at your work as a craft. It is separate from your own identity, and it's something that other people also know about and know how to do, and that you can constantly be improving on. Very few people are complete masters at their craft, and so it's really helpful to realize that you're on a journey where you want to be honing that craft, and that might be a lifelong journey, and in order to get better at it, you have to be able to welcome feedback, which often comes in the form of criticism. These three techniques I just discussed are higher level mindset changes so that you as a person can be embracing learning, growth, and feedback on your professional journey. That's amazing. That takes a while, right? Like that is some fundamental inner work that you kind of have to constantly be doing. But if you set these targets for yourself and you reframe how you identify yourself, it does make you much more open to feedback and to criticism. That doesn't mean it's not hard in the moment, especially if that feedback is coming in the form of specifically criticism, where someone is telling you, you did not do this right. That can be very hard to hear, even if you have changed your fundamental beliefs about who you are and how you work to become more open. It can still be really hard to hear things as a criticism. So here's some specific things that you can do in the moment to show up well. And again, this is part of being that 36% of people who handle criticism well instead of the 92% that think they do, and apparently a lot of them don't. The very first thing you need to do when you're receiving criticism is, in the moment, do not react defensively. It can be very human and very natural to be defensive and put some walls up because you're protecting your ego. That's an ego defense mechanism to become defensive, right? Instead of doing that, pause, take a breath, and remind yourself, I am focused on growth. I'm going to hear this with a growth mindset. So do that self-talk in the moment. So again, pause, take a deep breath, and if someone looks at you like this while they're giving you the criticism, just say, oh, I'm listening, so just give me a moment because I'm wanting to process what you're saying. That's okay. Most people will, if you say that, they recognize that you're being open to that and that you're not reacting defensively. So again, pause, take a breath, and do a little bit of a mental reset to remind yourself, I'm open to growth. I have a growth mindset. I'm interested to hear what this is. The important thing to remember about defensiveness is that defensiveness shuts down learning and listening. You are not able to listen well if you're caught up in this emotional reaction. Defensiveness shuts down communication and learning. It's very hard to listen, and it's hard to have communication be a two-way street in a conversation where the reaction is about defensiveness and ego protection. So if you can take that breath, if you can reground yourself and focus on the conversation, you're going to get something out of it. The goal in this conversation, even if the criticism feels like an attack, the goal in the conversation is to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? What can I get out of this? That's going to be a common thread as we talk about critiques, criticism, and feedback. Is your job as somebody who wants to grow and hone their craft, and as somebody who wants to drive towards excellence and constantly improve, your goal is to always ask yourself, what can I learn from what I'm hearing right now? What can I learn from what I'm experiencing? What can I learn from what they're trying to tell me? Because there's always something there. And that's your job, is to get down to that nugget of truth for you. The last thing I'm going to say about defensiveness is that the larger the emotional reaction on your part, honestly, that's a really big signal that they're touching on a fundamental truth. You would not be defensive if there wasn't something there. So again, in the moment, the more defensive you feel, the bigger a sign it is that you do need to listen to what they're saying, because they're touching a nerve, and them touching a nerve means that they're onto something and that there's some truth there. So your job, again, is to ground yourself so that you can listen and find that nugget of truth and look for the thing that you need to be learning out of this situation. It's one of the hardest things to do, but sometimes the biggest growth is from pulling down our walls, really listening and hearing the areas where we can improve. The next technique is to actually get curious and seek to understand. Now, this mantra is similar to the other one, but a little bit different, because in order to shift into curiosity, this is where you say to yourself, I'm open to learning. I'm curious what they're trying to tell me. I'm interested to hear what they're trying to tell me so that I can learn. So reground into a place of curiosity. Those are just 3 phrases that work for me as suggestions to how you can reground into curiosity. Find one that works for you. But that is something that I found, is that if I'm being criticized or critiqued, if I can get to a place of curiosity, that helps me get to a place where I'm genuinely seeking to understand and find that nugget of truth that we talked about. So in order to use this technique, they're giving you criticism, you're regrounding, you're not reacting defensively, right? So let's say defensiveness isn't your issue. How do you still get to that place of interest? This is where you can ask questions. And you can tell the person, I had not considered this. This is the first time I'm hearing it. I'd love to learn more about what you're saying to me. You're expressing that openness. Now, do not use the words, I am open to your feedback or I hear you. Whenever anybody says that, that actually means that they're not, just so you know. What you want to do is show. This is show, not tell. Show that you're open to that feedback by asking questions about that feedback. Show that you're curious by genuinely expressing curiosity. So again, you can let them know, hey, I haven't heard this before. I'd love to learn more about what you're saying. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions, because I really want to understand what you're saying to me? Demonstrate that you're curious by telling them that you want to understand, so that you're setting the stage to be able to ask questions without coming across as being defensive. Some really good questions that you can use when you're receiving criticism is understanding, well, what does that look like? So if they're critiquing a specific behavior, you can say, oh, what did that look like when I did that? What was the impact of that? How did that feel? You're kind of asking specifically, what did I do? But without saying, what did I do? And without saying, give me some examples. It's implied that you're saying, give me some examples, but you're giving them cues on how to express them to you. So again, what did that look like? Another great question is, what would be a better way of handling that? So if they're critiquing how you handled a certain situation, you genuinely were doing the best you could in that situation, you didn't know what else you could do, that's a great way to say, I didn't know what else I could do. Because the point isn't for you to convince them that you did the right thing. It's, again, human nature to want to explain where we're coming from when we're being criticized, because you want them to understand you. But in this situation, your role is to be more open to hearing what someone else has to say. So instead of explaining where you were coming from and explaining how you felt in that moment, or explaining why you did something, you want to instead ask them, you're right, that is what happened. Can you give me some ideas on how I could have handled that better? Or what would it look like to handle that differently? I haven't actually seen someone do that before. So what would it look like to do that better? Again, what would it look like? What would it look like is a question that opens up people talking about, again, behavior versus character. So instead of asking them, describe these behaviors, which can sound a little off-putting and formal and in some cases aggressive, instead you're saying, what does it look like? And they will then organically and naturally describe behaviors to you. So just a nice way to have a better conversation, because a lot of times if somebody is criticizing you, while they may have good intent and while they may have good information, they're not always expressing it super well. But again, it's not your job to criticize how they're criticizing you. It's your job to get to the truth of what you need to be doing differently and how you can grow. Another good question is, how have you seen someone do that in a way that works for you or in a way that works better? I use this sometimes with clients. This you have to be careful of, because if you say it wrong or with the wrong tone of voice, it can come off as defensive. So take this one with a grain of salt. Your mileage may vary. But I do this with clients sometimes because I'm subtly reminding them that what they prefer may not be what all my other clients prefer, and that I may be doing something that works with a bunch of my clients that just doesn't work for them. So I want to understand their preferences, but without saying any of that. So again, a great way to express that is, how have you seen this work in a way that works with you? Or I'd love to know what works better with this executive team or with this steering committee, or the executives at your company do seem to really focus on the thing that you're talking to me about. So how have you seen that work well with them? Again, that's implying a lot of things about them having specific needs and that you are open to tailoring towards those needs without you sounding defensive. All right, the third technique for handling criticism in the moment is one you've heard before, but you may not know how to do. And this is, you cannot take it personally. Cannot. So what does it mean to not take something personally? I'm going to be transparent that I struggled earlier in my career for a very long time with don't take things personally, because I put my heart, my passion, and my soul into my work. So whenever someone told me not to take something personally, I'm like, work is very personal to me. It is part of who I am. It is literally how I express myself and how I'm trying to contribute to the world. So you can't tell me not to take it personally. But when it comes to criticism, you can't take it personally. Here's what that looks like. When you're getting criticized and you hear my voice echoing in your brain, don't take it personally. Again, do a strategic pause in the conversation. And inside, you have to separate the behavior they're describing from how you perceive yourself and from who you are as a person. Because our self-perception is very closely tied to our identity. So you're going to have to set that aside. If you compartmentalize in any area of your life, take those compartmentalization skills and use them now, because you need to separate how you see yourself as a person and how you value yourself from the feedback or criticism that you're getting. And when you do that separation, what I want you to tell yourself in your head is, they're describing a behavior. I want to better understand that behavior. They're not making a value judgment about who you are as a person. And what happens when we get criticism is that is what it feels like, is it feels like a value judgment or any kind of judgment about who we are. So with this technique, what you're doing is you're separating the work you do from who you are as a person. You need to compartmentalize that piece of it, and you need to focus on the work you do and the behavior they're describing, and just laser focus on that behavior. So set everything aside and get curious about that behavior and separate it from your identity and what you value about yourself. Even if this is a skill you think you're great at. I have been critiqued on meeting facilitation. I think I'm great at meeting facilitation. I had to understand where that critique was coming from. I'll talk about that example in a minute. So in this case, just focus on the behavior they're trying to talk to you about, and then use the skills we just talked about getting curious and ask questions about that behavior. So when they're discussing this behavior with you and you've compartmentalized your sense of self from what they're talking about, this is a great time to remind yourself that you can change a behavior without changing who you are. So what they're saying isn't a personal attack. It has nothing to do with who you are as a person, and it has nothing to do with your value and the value you bring. They're just trying to get you to fix something that they perceive as a problem. All of this requires that you get rid of rigid self-perception and self-limiting beliefs. Self-limiting beliefs hold us back from growth. They hold us back from positive change. People naturally resist feedback that doesn't align with how they see themselves. That's just not helpful. People resist feedback that doesn't align with how they see themselves. But you can't grow if you don't know, and you can't know if you don't listen. So you're going to have to set aside your rigid self-beliefs and your self-limiting behaviors to actively listen to what they're trying to convey. This is a good time to bring up what is probably running through the back of your head, which is that not all criticism or feedback is valid. Fair. But more of it is valid than you think. So we did a whole episode on how to handle bad feedback. I'll link it. In that episode, we talk a lot about how to identify bad feedback from harsh feedback and criticism. And we also talk about how to stop worrying about your perception of where they're coming from. Because another belief that I see people having that is part of an ego defense mechanism, even if they don't think it is they start ascribing reasons for that other person's judgment, and that shuts them down to listening. I've seen this happen quite a few times with people who are struggling with criticism or feedback that they've received from team members, their bosses, mentors, peers, or their leaders. And what they do is they're just saying that because XYZ. If you find yourself saying, they're just saying that because, stop. What you're doing is you're ascribing some sort of ill intent or misalignment to that person instead of focusing on yourself. I know that's harsh, but that is the harsh truth. That, again, is inhibiting your growth. So you're going to have to set aside perfectionism, ego defense, and the natural reaction to start telling yourself stories about why they're criticizing you. All of that is holding you back. It's holding you back from growth, it's holding you back from development, and it is holding you back from being better at what you do. It is preventing you from improving at your craft. I have a lot of respect for you. I want you to improve at your craft, which means you are going to have to handle criticism well, both in the moment and taking it as a development opportunity. So if you're hearing this and you're struggling with, I'm still caught up in that bad feedback and I do think they're out to get me and all these stories, go back and watch our video about bad feedback, because we get really in depth about, again, the emotional reaction, how to understand if the feedback is valuable. More than anything, I do want you to understand that your job is to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? And you're responsible for your learning journey. That means that you haven't lost any control over your development or over your path just because someone's criticizing you. That is really important to know. So let's talk about the example I alluded to where somebody criticized my meeting facilitation. Now, this criticism had all of the hallmarks of bad feedback. This person didn't ask me if it was a good time. It wasn't. They came in very emotional, blah, blah, blah. Like, I could sit down and tell a story about they gave me this feedback because of all these reasons, blah, blah, blah. Honestly, they did not do a good job giving me this feedback or criticism. It doesn't change the fact that they were right. It was a bad meeting. Like, honestly, the meeting they were criticizing me for was genuinely a bad meeting, and I was facilitating it. So at the end of the day, I was responsible. What they wanted me to take away, however, was different from what I took away, because I'm responsible for my own learnings and I get to own that. So we agreed it wasn't a great meeting. We disagreed on why. And it doesn't mean that there's no room for me to hone my facilitation skills, but really it was a bigger fundamental issue in that it was a very sensitive topic in the meeting that I was trying to facilitate. Not everybody in the meeting had the foundational information they needed to discuss that sensitive topic. So they were not prepared for that meeting. My takeaway was I needed to better prepare this group of people for this meeting because it was such a difficult topic that they were kind of resisting the meeting and arguing about, the way we were trying to talk about the meeting. But all of that was just because they were uncomfortable with the conversation. So my job would have been to have the conversation at a different time or do a better job preparing them for the meeting. It wasn't about the specific techniques in the meeting, but part of facilitation is making sure your audience is prepared for the conversation, giving them foundational knowledge, giving them foundational tools and skills. So again, it was a very valid criticism that it was a really crappy meeting and that in some way I was responsible for it. But what I decided to do with that is my own decision and part of my own journey. And I'm giving you that example because I do want to highlight that the criticism is going to be valid in some way. Whether their specific example is a little off or what they're identifying as the root cause of the problem or what they think you need to be doing differently, that may not all resonate with you. So even though I'm saying to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? That doesn't mean that the learning you take away gets to be dictated to you. And that really depends on where you are in your career. When I received this criticism, I was at a point in my career where I got to say, I'm not going down a path where I care to facilitate a lot more meetings. I was actually doing this as a favor. That's not the skill I want to hone. The skill I want to hone is, as a leader, knowing if my peers are ready for a hard conversation and supporting them to get there if they're not. That was more important to me, so that was the learning I took from it. Depending on where you are in your career, you may have a different set of context and background and self-awareness and drive towards a path that may shape what you choose to do with that feedback or that criticism that you've received. It is such a good feeling to know that you can own what you do with that criticism. Let that sink in for a second. You get to own what you do with it. It doesn't have to affect you emotionally in order for you to learn something from it. The solution someone's giving you may not be the right solution for you, but fundamentally, there's something to what they're saying. Another thing I noticed earlier in my career was that I would get criticisms that I didn't think were accurate. And earlier in my career, I was very caught up in that. This isn't right. That's not accurate. But what really turned this around for me and what took me from being a technical resource to being on a leadership track was shifting away from worrying about whether their criticism was right or wrong. Because what I asked myself was, what can I do differently so they see me in a different way? That was hugely powerful, because maybe the behaviors they were nitpicking, again, maybe they weren't right about it. And maybe I was right that they didn't see the 99% of the time that I did something totally different. But key into that for a second. They saw one thing and reacted to it and criticized me in this early career moment. And in my head, I'm like, well, that's not fair. I did this thing 99 times and they just don't know. Listen to yourself in that moment. They didn't know. And think about what I'm saying. Do you see where I'm going with this? That was my learning at that time, was I need to do a better job championing the 99% of the time where this went well. I need to make sure that I control their perception of what I'm doing, or else they're always going to hone in on the thing that they see. And if you're quiet about your successes and your failures are loud, you're known for your failures. So this starts to touch on a different topic, which is how to control your brand at work, which is very important. I've got an upcoming course that's all about how to control your brand and your brand story, where we get into a lot of detail on how to do that. But I just want you to think about, if you're at that stage in your career where you think that the criticism is quote unquote unfair, and you follow that thread of they're not seeing this or they're not acknowledging that, what you're learning can be is, I need to do a better job talking about these other things or making sure that this work is more visible. So fundamentally, this is going to be another hard truth that I'm going to say. Sorry. Fundamentally, if they're criticizing you, you've done something wrong. You may not have done the thing wrong that they're describing to you, but you could be doing something better so this criticism isn't coming up. And whether that's marketing yourself better, championing your successes better, making your successes more visible than your failures, or whether it's something else entirely. But if you're sitting there going, Gabby, I've used all your techniques and I still think this criticism's unfair. Okay, well then why are they saying it? Why is there an opportunity for them to criticize you? And then ask yourself, what can I do differently so there are not these opportunities for them to criticize me? Think about it. I have another example where I had a project manager and the client was constantly criticizing her for not producing a project plan. She was really frustrated about it. I'm like, well, give her a project plan. She thought it was unfair for all these reasons. And doesn't she know I'm so busy? And I'm like, fundamentally, you're the project manager and she's the client. You need to give her a project plan. From the outside, it's really simple. It's very clear. But when you're in the weeds and you have all these reasons and excuses for things, it can be very unclear. So if you're using the techniques I just described and you're still a little bit stuck in this, I would challenge you to find a trusted third party, your mentor or somebody, not just your friends who's going to rile you up. You know, I say that all the time. But find an objective third party and ask them, and usually they'll tell you the thing you're missing, because we all have blind spots. So if you are really struggling with criticism, you do want to learn from it. You can't get past some of your biases that are preventing you from hearing the nugget of truth in the criticism, then bring in someone who's objective and just be like, this is what they're saying, this is what I'm thinking, what am I missing? And this is another, I'm open to the possibility. I'm open to the possibility that I'm missing something. I'm open to the possibility that I could be doing something differently that would work better. That is a great way to get yourself on a very successful track at work, is to constantly be asking yourself, what is it that I can be doing better? Criticism does not feel like an attack if you want to know what you can be doing better. And I know people say feedback's a gift and everyone's like, you know, I think it's overused. But again, if you have a learning and growth mindset and you're constantly asking yourself the question of what can I be doing better, whenever someone criticizes you, that is a gift, because it's an opportunity to do something better. All of these techniques will help you show up better in handling criticism. They will improve your emotional resilience, and they will genuinely help you grow as a person and as a professional in your career. One last thing that I want to highlight is that if you are genuinely open to criticism and you have that learner mindset, leaders around you will want to invest in you. This is amazing. When I flipped that switch earlier in my career to shifting to what can I be doing better and had that mindset, ever since then, every leader above me has wanted to support my career and support my development. And when I got to a point where I was a leader who could start lifting people up as well, that is also what I look for. I'm not going to invest extra time in the employees who resist change and resist feedback and are defensive and handle criticism like an attack. I'll help them, I'll give them the feedback, but the people who get my extra time are the people who show that they want to learn and grow and change. Frankly, a powerful tip in your career is knowing that the more that you demonstrate openness to learning and the more that you demonstrate growth through learning, the more your leaders will want to invest in your development and support your career, whether that's through their own mentorship and coaching, or it might look like them signing you up for internal leadership or external leadership development training. They're more likely to help pay for a coach. So there are a lot of resources that companies bring to bear to support the growth of leaders and future leaders. Your ability to tap into that is completely contingent on you demonstrating that you can learn and grow. And this goes back to owning and telling your own story. It is incredible at work for you to tell stories of something that you've learned or that you took feedback and grew that skill and improved it. You tell those stories and the leaders that work with you tell those stories. This will absolutely be a springboard to launch your development and the support you get at work for your career. This was a fun topic. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to hear about your experiences with criticism, whether it's giving criticism, which we can talk more about how to do that well, or whether it's receiving criticism. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if you haven't already watched it, go watch our video on bad feedback where we get very, very in-depth on how to interpret feedback constructively. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.